couple more things. Team structure. Been waiting very patiently for the team structure question. All right. So remember one of the things that I said in our first module about that better development process of saying, okay, we're going to have business analysts and architects and PM that are interacting with business stakeholders to turn workarounds into actual requirements and schedules. That group of people that is very senior and is interfacing with the business, that's IT ops, all right? A lot of the technical specialists in the organization, your best mobile developer, your best DBA when it comes to performance tuning, they tend to sit in IT ops. They're often the people that are looking at Angular 2 coming out saying, okay, seeing as it's going to take us just about the same amount of effort to go from Angular 1 to Angular 2 as it would be for us to go from Angular to React, I think React is the better choice for us, and leading the organization in that direction. So a lot of technical specialists are often in IT ops influencing framework choices, programming language choices, infrastructure choices, and then in many cases serving as consultants that kind of go between the various service-oriented teams and helping promote the use of those libraries and patterns and approaches to get people moving in the right direction, right? So yes, you'd expect to see roughly a team per service. And in those teams, similarly, we'd expect to see that cross-functional type of behavior, meaning we're probably going to have some database-y type people and Java developers for the Java systems that service needs to be in, and some .NET people, and if we still have COBOL around, then maybe some COBOL people, and testers and architects and PMs. But the important thing that I want you to understand here is that IT ops is the interface with the business. There isn't the situation where a business stakeholder is going to come in and say, well, I'm from marketing. I'm just going to talk to the marketing service team. Can you guys build me something? That is not allowed, right? Nobody backdoors and says, I just have a small little request. Those things come through IT ops, that team, and IT ops may look and say, okay, simple, straightforward, nothing architectural, risky, whatever. I'll pass that on. But there's always that element of, wait a minute, is this a workaround? Is there something deeper that should be done over here? So even though the service teams are aligned with business capabilities, that does not create the opening for business stakeholders to go and ask for stuff from them directly, right? Branding is also here, but I'm kind of putting them more to the bottom because they're less involved as a team in a lot of the core architectural or implementation decisions. They're more of, after most of the decisions have been done, oh, by the way, we need to make a change to the view model in order to make this work. All right. So this tends to be the simpler team. I put it here in a cross-cutting kind of fashion because ultimately the view models that it creates ultimately connect with the data of each of those services. All right? Now, as you can imagine, this model scales fairly well to very large groups of people. So if you're talking about 7 to 10 services, you're talking about 7 to 10 teams-ish, where each of these teams could easily be in the area of maybe 5 to 15 people, and that this model will work just fine. So it can scale into that area of roughly 150-ish people. Now, you might be working in an organization saying, well, that's awesome, but we're 6. All of us in IT. And that includes the guy that actually needs to install patches for the Windows servers and all that kind of stuff. So it's great that it scales to 150. And maybe when I'm in an organization like that, we'll do that. But how does this work for me? So the benefit of service thinking in a smaller organization is keeping the code clean. The challenge with having more people is just having more people understand that this is how we work and what the service boundaries are. If you have 6 people, that's only 6 people that need to remember how we do things. And it's much more likely that if somebody does something wrong that you'll notice. In a group of 150 people, it's much harder. That's why there are all sorts of layers of management and whatnot. So you can still operate in a service-oriented manner to keep your code service-oriented, even without needing to have a team for each one of these things. So you don't necessarily say, all right, well, person A is going to be IT ops, person B is going to be marketing, person C is going to be shipping. Having a one-person team, usually not effective. All right, so in a smaller environment, obviously, you can't really do this. But in a larger environment, this tends to work. And, or let me say, it works up to a point. One of the interesting things where this model doesn't work so well is, and let me see if I have a slide for that next. No, okay. So there's certain types of logic which we've very briefly skipped over, and I think I might have used the term engine before. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but we'll take a break first. Where it requires a deeper level of involvement from multiple services in order to fulfill the needs of that area. Now, in those cases, this model doesn't tend to work that well. When the majority of your business domain fits neatly into these boundaries, then great, this model works just fine. One of the variations on this that I've seen some organizations start to experiment as they've arrived at this size is to say, you know what, there's a certain amount of siloism that gets created, which isn't that good. We've been experimenting with the model that we've read about in other places called task forces, where the more general idea is that instead of having teams that are long-lived and aligned with service boundaries, that more ad hoc teams are pulled together for a thing that needs to be built. Now, the challenge when doing this, and why I don't recommend going directly to this, is that this can go back to the business comes to us and says, I need a feature. Give me 5 developers and go build that feature. That's not what this is. All right? So you can transition to a more task force-oriented model, I'd say, after first starting with something like this and having a good IT ops boundary with your business stakeholders. And then there's a certain element of looking at what needs to be done, which people have the knowledge and skills, let's bring them together. They'll work on the thing, implementing stuff in various services to get the feature done, deliver that, and then they will disband. One of the things that tends to be required that we've started, so we've started the task force thing about 2 years ago. And about a year ago, we added another layer on top of that to preserve this kind of thing from before. We call them maintainer groups, but it's a smaller group of people who are meant to preserve the knowledge of this code base. So anytime we're pulling together a task force to work on some kind of feature, project, whatever, oftentimes what we'll do is we'll include a couple of people from those maintainer groups on that task force, but intentionally some people that aren't on any, so that there's some constant circulation of new ideas and people that are going to challenge the status quo. And when they're doing the work, they don't actually get to commit their changes directly to that code base. They'd need to submit the code that they've changed as a pull request to the corresponding repositories. And then those maintainer groups, those review that and say, is this in line with everything else that we have in our code base? So it kind of gives a code review element to every task force that is working. So we get some existing knowledge, some new knowledge, circulation and preservation of ideas about how the code base works. It's worked very well for us in the past year. We're not going back. And other organizations that have started here are starting to move more towards a combination of task forces and treating developers as sort of people that aren't just stuck in, you're in service team X or in service team Y. So, but I'll reiterate this, I wouldn't recommend jumping directly to that. It requires a fair bit of maturity and time for people to get used to doing that kind of work. So the good news is that organizations as a whole are figuring out better ways to implement service-oriented code bases. The bad news is that as time progresses, those models are becoming less and less strict. So it's not the kind of thing that you can come to an organization as a cookie cutter and say, do X, it's going to work for you. But the reality is that that's never worked. It's kind of like saying, do Agile. Who's doing Agile? Okay. Who is Agile in the organization really? All right, I see fewer hands going up, right? So that's the kind of difference, all right? It takes time to bring people along to get them to live and breathe those principles. Org structures are the cookie cutter parts of it. So you're going to need to balance these things together. I would recommend going slow. And on Friday, we'll talk about how you can go through a process of migrating both your organization to being more service-oriented at the same time as you're migrating your code base to be more service-oriented. Hint, it's not going to be a big bang rewrite, in case you were wondering. All right, last thing before we head to the break, when not to do service-oriented architecture. Bullet point number 1, startups. This is one of the things that sometimes happens. Somebody will be on this course several months, maybe a year later. They say, okay, I'm going to go do a startup. Send me an email saying, Udi, I'm doing a startup. I'm going to do SOA right because now there are no constraints. There's nobody telling me what I can and can't do. I'm going to do SOA by the book on this one. And every time that happens, I have to say, I'm really sorry to tell you this, but if you're building a brand new business, startup, now is not the time to do SOA. And they're crushed. They're like, but I thought that now I could finally do it. There's no, and I'll explain why. The thing about SOA is we're trying to model stable business abstractions, right? The thing about a startup, it doesn't know what business it's in. Right? That's kind of the point of a startup, to discover a business problem worth solving that somehow makes money. And it often takes quite a long time and changes of direction before you uncover a problem like that. So in the early days, actually, SOA is not a good idea. If anything, I'd say you'd want to use, there's a whole bunch of literature that's been written on this, the lean startup methodology, which in short can be said, write the minimum amount of the dirtiest code possible to discover whether this is a business problem worth solving. And if that's a very simple email sign-up form, do you have problem X? We can solve it. Put your email here. If you get 500 people that fill in that email, hey, you're onto something. But that's not the time to start saying, oh, okay, so does this field belong with that field? The answer for every startup is, well, we don't know. I mean, maybe that idea will end up being the killer app, and that will just take off and become the next Twitter, Facebook, whatever. So there aren't stable business abstractions in startups, which is why most of the failed startups you don't ever really hear about. It just sort of quietly dies because nothing really happened there. Didn't matter how good their code was. All right? So don't focus on SOA if you're doing a startup. Now, if you're in maybe the word mature startup is somewhat of a contradiction in terms. Okay. If you're in a startup that has survived long enough to find a business problem worth solving, that the quick and dirty code that they wrote is now buckling under its weight, and someone says, rewrite, and there actually is money to finance a rewrite, then maybe that is the time to consider doing SOA. That you've been around long enough to actually be able to uncover a stable business abstraction. So you could say, Facebook. In the early days, they didn't really know what business that they were in. Nowadays, it's clear. They're a media company. Just like any other media company, what do they have? They've got a bunch of eyeballs, and they sell those eyeballs to people that want to show them ads. This is the same model that worked for television, and before television it was radio, and before radio it was newspapers. The media business has been fundamentally the same business for a long time. Content brings eyeballs, eyeballs brings advertisers, advertisers bring money. Great. There happens to be a lot of stable business abstractions there. Let's go do SOA. But until Facebook realized that they were a media company, then it was very difficult for them to find those abstractions. All right?
Once in a while, I work in an agency, a government agency. They're passing new laws. New laws typically change everything for us. Practically a new business every time we change a new law. We treat us as a startup at the time, then find the boundaries, because there are a lot of discussions in the initial phases of the new law. This means in the business side, the lawyers and stuff, they don't even know what the new law means.
Neither does the government.
So what you're saying is we should take it a little bit slower with the SOA adoption on the new stuff, which is not stable.
So I'd say in an environment where there aren't stable business abstractions, or the business abstractions are still forming and gelling, then you could potentially treat that as a kind of startup on the side and say, well, let's just do some exploratory coding and see, is it like this, is it like that, knowing full well that we might be wrong and have to redo that. And as you were saying, when the government is passing these laws, the lawyers, the business people might not know exactly what to do with it. I got to tell you, a lot of times the politicians or the bureaucrats working for the politicians that pass these laws still don't understand what the ramifications are. And then they go pass on a follow-up law, and then a clarification, and then a memo, and then that ultimately starts addressing all of the edge cases that nobody thought about. And then 3 years after the original law is passed, now people understand, oh, okay, this is what this thing is about. And now we can fold this in as another stable business abstraction. So yes, there needs to be that understanding that there's always going to be some volatility in the world, and we need to be able to handle that. And a startup mentality is not necessarily a bad way of doing that. Right? Second category is, I'm going to call them the platform projects. Now, a lot of platform projects actually come out of startups, usually B2B type startups. So if this sounds familiar, no, I wasn't spying on your company, all right? But this tends to happen more often than not. So some new idea is formed, somebody writes some code to implement it. Things are going well, we're getting more users, more customers, etc. And at a certain point in time, we get a new category of customer. Somebody who, let's say, if we've been selling to small and medium businesses, for the most part, then a salesperson is able to close Coca-Cola or Procter & Gamble or Walmart or somebody like that. And they come in and they say, we love your product, it's amazing, we just have some minor modifications that we'd like. Can you make it so that we can add our own custom fields to any of the tables in your system? And the developers are like, yeah, I don't think that'll be a problem. We just add like a JSON column or an XML column to each one of our tables, and problem solved. And then the guy says, well, yeah, that's good. We also need to be able to search and sort and filter and group based on each of those custom things that we put in there. And then the first time that that gets built, and one of those big enterprise customers does a search, that ends up becoming a full table scan because you can't index into the JSON or into the XML of that. And then when that full table scan hits, then the system stops effectively for all of the other users. People say, oh, the system is slow. And you're like, oh, crap, what am I going to do now? And then you start caching and you start doing a whole bunch of other things to try to improve the performance. But things only go from bad to worse because then they say, you know what? Your business rules are great. We'd like to be able to step into your workflows. So between step 2 and 3, to be able to run some of our custom rules on top of some of the custom data that we stored in there, and then decide what the next step is going to be. And you're starting to think, how the hell am I going to do that? And you start building some more customizable, generic, extensible DSL thing that they can define the rule in which, when to skip a step and when to go back a step and when to request an approval. And eventually, sooner or later, somebody says it would be faster to write the system from scratch because it wasn't designed for this level of extensibility. And then it's not just a rewrite project. This is going to be the generic uber extensible platform that's going to be able to solve Coca-Cola and Procter & Gamble and Walmart and all of the small and medium customers. Who's working on a project like this? No? Some hands going up? Okay, yes. I have some bad news for you. SOA is not going to help. I have more bad news. I have never seen or heard, not myself or secondhand, of a project like this that ended up being successful. There are a handful of examples where this ends up working, but not the way that people thought. So on the one hand, what you have is SAP. SAP is the generic uber extensible, customizable platform from hell that is used for big enterprise customers, but there is not a single small and medium type of business that would ever touch this thing with a 10-foot pole. It's awful. Every SAP implementation, it's not just a, well, you download SAP and then you install it and you go. It's not a as a service where you swipe a credit card and sign up. No, you bring in 50 consultants from KPMG to run a project for 3 years to implement SAP, which is just a fancy way of saying, let's bring in 50 developers to write a whole bunch of custom code. Yes, they're using the generic customizable platform, but at that point in time, when SAP puts out a new version of their platform, you can't upgrade. And that is what success looks like. That's SAP, right? On the flip side, you have, let's call it the Salesforce model, which has historically been targeted at small and medium businesses. It's quick, it's simple, you sign up, you swipe a credit card. It has some built-in extensibility out of the box, but you need to do something else. Okay, you're going to need a Salesforce consultant, a Salesforce developer who's going to be going in and writing a whole bunch of custom code. And that person will be really sharp because if they use the wrong APIs, then their code will break when Salesforce releases whatever next version of their platform is there. And Salesforce has gone to great lengths to educate and build an ecosystem of these third-party developers and consultants who do Salesforce customization type things from within the platform. And they go to great lengths to make sure that they're not breaking APIs nearly as much as possible. Has anybody ever written Salesforce type code extension? Enjoyable or not? Not enjoyable, no. It is not a pleasant experience to code in this environment. It is very limiting and all sorts of things like, this should work. No, it doesn't. But it says in the documentation and the sample, yeah, that sample's out of date. And that is what success looks like. And yes, Salesforce was able to pull it off organically over time. And they won the SMB space, but they didn't unseat SAP. SAP is still there, alive and kicking, and they're doing their own thing. The important thing I want you to understand from this is that in both successful cases, extensibility is done by programmers. It is not the end users, a non-technical person, that is dragging and dropping some stuff. Success involves programmers. The person who says, I'm going to create a generic extensible platform that will not require programmers, I've never seen one. Never seen one that's been successful at a large scale. I've seen lots of organizations that's tried. And when I come to an organization that's doing this, I say, look, I got to tell you, I've never heard of anybody who's made this work. Not using SOA, not using any technique at all. Not now, not 10 years ago. Now, the better organizations, they kind of say, oh, okay, maybe we should rethink what we've been planning on doing. Some of the worst ones, and I had a client like this, where the manager in charge said, we'll be first. And you're thinking, oh my God, the ego on this guy. 3 years later, that person was canned, that line of business was shut down, and some of the developers were able to jump ship fast enough to another line of business in the company. The ones that didn't ended up being fired as a part of that line of business shutting down. I've never, ever heard this work, and every organization that's tried has failed. So if that's you, say, well, we're going to do SOA. That's going to solve the problem. Say, that's not it. Then we'll do microservices. That'll solve the problem. That's not good. We'll do NoSQL. We'll do functional programming languages. Maybe one of these days, some computing architectural methodology, technology thing will solve this problem. I don't know, but there hasn't been one up until now. So if you're in this environment or somebody's thinking about moving in this direction, tell them to stop. If they won't stop, I have one small recommendation, is to say, look, this isn't going to work. What you can do is to do kind of a fork, if you will, where you're going to have one part of the organization that is chasing after the big enterprises, and in essence, they're going to become a consulting turnkey project company. So who said that they're working at Sogeti? Yes. So Sogeti, KPMG, it's the big client comes to us, says, build me a project to do X, Y, Z, and all this. And then we put a whole team of developers, and then we build that for them. Great. You want to do that? Now, that's fine. You are now in competition with Sogeti and Capgemini and KPMG and Ernst & Young and Accenture and IBM Global Services. Good luck to you. But that's a business model where I can say, look, there are 12 examples of companies that are doing that successfully, making money. That works. On the flip side, you can say, you want to do a small, medium business software as a service thing with limited extensibility. You want to do like a Zendesk or some help desk support system or HR as a service that maybe you started there. Great. I can name, just do a Google search for successful SaaS companies. There are thousands of them. They work great. It's a successful business model, not too much extensibility. Do that. It's a product company at that point. It's not a consulting company, and it needs to be structured differently. So you have that code base, that team, those products, those projects. That works. If you want to do both, great. Then create two companies, one of them that does X and one of them that does Y. Don't try to do both. Yeah.
Microservices that you don't like.
What is it about microservices that I don't like? You could say, Udi, of all the things that you don't like, is there anything that you do like?
It's a good course you do then on microservices.
So the issue that I have is, and it's not just about microservices. It's the fact that we're not very good as an industry at learning from our failures. So, and it's true about Western society as a whole. It's the failure is considered something to hide, to not talk about. And some startups, some people in the startup community have started to shift that a little bit to talk more publicly about failures and things that they did wrong and what they learned from them. In the consulting space, it's actually one of the, I'd say the biggest benefits is that consultants are often conference speakers, and then we meet each other at conferences and say, so what war stories do you have? What have you seen work and not work? So we're able to circulate a lot of things that don't work and things that we see do work, and to say, oh, okay, I've seen that work as well. Maybe we'll name that as a pattern type thing, or I've seen that fail as well. Have you ever seen that work? Someone says, I think I remember seeing that work. And then somebody else says, no, I was on that project 2 years later, they shut it down. And through that, we're able to circulate okay, that's stuff that's not working. Now, the other problem that we have, and again, it's a Western culture thing, is that we say, but Netflix does microservices. Therefore, Netflix is awesome. Or sorry, it's the other way around. Netflix is awesome. Netflix does microservices. Microservices must therefore be awesome. That's lazy reasoning. The challenge is, again, that there's a very strong emphasis on what are popular consumer-facing companies doing. Facebook is using Cassandra. Facebook is really big, has lots of money. Cassandra must make me very big and make me lots of money. Or Twitter is using technology X. Twitter is a very well-known, successful company. If I use technology X, I will be a very big, successful, popular company. That doesn't work. So it's not specifically about microservices. It's that general pattern of kind of, let's call it cargo cult programming, of saying, I'm going to do the same things that they're doing because they're successful, without realizing that Facebook being successful might have had nothing to do with Cassandra. Or Netflix ending up being a very successful company was that they were at the right place at the right time. From a business perspective, had a good pricing model that worked out. And that was their business success. And that they actually succeeded despite their use of microservices and not because of it. So the technical issue that I have with microservices is the same technical issue that I had with web services to begin with, which is that they take a concept of logical architecture and they couple that one-to-one with an element of deployment architecture. So they say, logical unit equals deployment unit. And you can think of that as kind of tying your shoelaces together. Say things that could and should be logically that could be independent from each other to have degrees of freedom. Now I'm going to turn that into a coupling. So that, in essence, creates a model where all I can do is kind of, if I move this leg, I have to move that leg forward. So I end up sort of shuffling around. Now, this wouldn't be so bad if everybody else that I'm looking at, all of my friends that are also developers, well, they're doing web services or REST services, even if they're not microservices, there's still that same concept of logical and deployment architecture being tied one-to-one. So if you grow up in an environment where your shoelaces are tied together, and this is how you learn how to walk, and all of your friends are walking around like this, and then someone says, watch me scale. And all the friends are like, oh my God, look at that. I want those shoes. Some badass Nike shoes he's got there scaling. Now, I kind of look at that from the side and say, seriously? Why are you all insisting on tying your shoelaces together? What possible good does that do? Well, Netflix does it. No, these things can be independent. And I hope you're beginning to see that you gain more flexibility by having that. But it was a problem with web services before microservices. It was a problem with Com+. Before .NET, it was the exact same thing, same unit. The difference was that even though Com+ had the isolation, it was possible, though not frequent, that people actually hosted Com+ things together. But you still needed to do all sorts of remote calls between Com+. And that was the same problem with distributed objects, a generation before that. So saying, why don't I like it? This is not just me. This is fallacies of distributed computing from 40 years ago. It's never really worked well. And once you've experienced working a different way, it kind of looks ridiculous from the side. So that's why I don't get invited to microservices conferences anymore. See, there's only so much fun that you can make of the audience and of your fellow speakers before they say, we're not going to invite you back next year, okay? So that's the when not to do SOA side of things. So be careful of these generic platform projects. They kill lots of careers. One last thing, and I know I'm way over time. If you're on one of these projects, all is not lost. All right? These are great resume-driven development projects. You know it's going to fail anyway. Just sit together as a team and say, what are you missing in your resume? You're missing some NoSQL? I got some NoSQL. So I'll agree that we use a NoSQL thing on this project if you'll agree that we can use F# as the programming language. Deal? And we just kind of fill in each other's blanks. And this becomes an F# MongoDB event sourcing React project. And the thing, when somebody says, why do you need all of these technologies? Oh, it's because it's so generic and extensible and all of these non-functional scalable requirements. F# performs very well, and MongoDB is web scale, and event sourcing gives us, you can justify any crap that you want. But it's resume-driven development. And when, not if, when the project goes south 2 years later, 3 years later, whatever that is, all of the team comes out ahead, right? Now, again, you can try to explain to the business why it isn't a good idea and why we should try to build this thing differently. But if they're going to insist on going down this path, no reason that you can't have a silver lining to that cloud. All right? So fantastic projects for resume-driven development.